The barometer was falling, and the building knew it. The ferry terminal at Hakodate creaked and shivered as gusts pushed against the doors, rattling the panes in their frames, so the sound traveled through the ticket hall like teeth chattering. Outside, coal smoke from the blunt-nosed Tōya Maru blew flat across the quay and smeared into the harbor mist. The Tsugaru Strait beyond the breakwater had that strange, pewter sheen sailors distrust, a tight, metallic glimmering, as if something just beneath the surface were pulling the light down. People arriving with grips and parcels sniffed the air and tugged coats closer, then glanced automatically at the wall clock, because the timetable promised a departure, and the timetable had always been right. It was September 26, 1954. The Tōya Maru was a big, practical creature, part ship, part bridge, built to swallow railway wagons and trucks and carry them, with their freight and the people who tended it, between Hokkaido and Honshu. Crews knew her habits. Passengers trusted her size and the regularity of her crossings. The route felt like a sentence people finished every day without thinking. You boarded in Hakodate, you arrived in Aomori, and your life proceeded as it had intended to proceed. Only the sky was arguing. Typhoon Marie had curved north and was sweeping weather into the strait in fits and surges. Earlier in the day, an outbound ferry had been cancelled. For a while, the word around the station was that the Tōya Maru would hold at the pier. Then, as afternoon deepened, the wind eased just enough to look like mercy. Rain softened to a fine grain on the windows. Flags stopped trying to escape their poles and only whispered. In that narrow, tempting lull, the calculation tipped. Freight had to move. Tickets were sold. People had made plans that trusted the habit of steel. The captain and harbor master spoke in the language of inches and gusts and experience. The decision came. Sail. On the quay, the apparatus of a train ferry did what it had been built to do. Wagons screeched down the rails that ran straight into the ship's belly. Chains were slung, hooks were hauled tight, wedges kissed iron tires. Trucks parked to either side, loads lashed down. In the passenger spaces, families arranged blankets on bunks. A soldier stowed his cap beneath his head like a talisman. A salesman checked that the samples in his case hadn't been jostled. A little girl, too keyed up to sit, fogged a window with her breath and drew circles she pretended were portholes. At 6:39 p.m., the siren sounded, long and low, the practiced assurance of a machine that understood its job. Lines came inboard. The gangway rattled up. Deckhands dogged hatches shut. The Tōya Maru eased off the pier, her funnel smutting the mist with a last smear of soot. Hakodate's lights slipped and slid in the rain-streaked glass and then became a dwindling golden necklace behind them. 2 cables beyond the breakwater, the pretense ended. The first wave hit the bow hard enough to travel through bones. Spray banged against the windows as if it had been thrown by an angry hand. In the wheelhouse, the wind meter spun up, paused, climbed again. The captain felt the shove on the superstructure, the way the ship's head wanted to wander now that the strait was showing its temper. He gave the order to anchor, hold position, ride the squall, wait for the tantrum to crest. The chain ran with a roaring rattle and came up tight. The ferry swung bow to as she was meant to do. For a while it worked. The hull shouldered the seas. The bow rose, crashed, rose again. The men on the bridge measured the minutes with their eyes, with the set of the whitecaps, with that private arithmetic long water teaches. Down in the saloon, a steward set a pot of tea into a cradle and told a nervous mother about the hundreds of crossings he'd seen in weather worse than this. A soldier played two-handed cards with a boy and lost on purpose until he didn't need to. But the storm was not a single mood. It was a conversation the Strait kept having with itself. The wind shifted and hardened, backing around so that the ship began to shear. The anchor chain, a living line strung into blackness, took the weight, juddered, and then, with the faithless glide a fisherman knows too well, began to creep across the seabed. On the chart, the ferry's mark slid toward Nanai Beach, a lee shore, a bad word for mariners, a place where waves carry you in because they feel like they're helping and then dash you where you cannot live. The vehicle deck telegraphed the change first. Steel on steel screamed. A chain link snapped with a pistol crack. A railway wagon, 10 tons of disciplined weight a moment ago, lurched and slammed into a stanchion hard enough to dent a world. That impact changed the angle of everything. The ship heeled a degree, then two. Another wagon tore loose and careened. A truck's lashings parted and the truck rolled. The mass inside the ship became a slow animal that refused to stay where it had been put. Every crash below was answered by a new tilt above. Cups slid. A suitcase began a deliberate journey across a cabin. A man who had been standing did not fall so much as find the floor had moved away from underneath him. Below, in the engine spaces, the sea arrived in a different voice. It hissed through seams, drummed through a loosened plate, found a stairwell, and came down it with the entitlement of a regular. Pumps took their stance against it, hammering, stubborn. Stokers worked in a rain of sweat and coal grit, feeding the boilers to keep the heart beating. Steam pressure wavered, steadied, sagged. The chief shouted numbers that should have been steady but refused to be. There are nights when a ship is all will. This one was discovering the limits of will. When the engines coughed and died, the silence had a shape. Up top, the wind took the helpless hull in both hands and pushed her broadside to the seas. Now each wave hit along her length with a malice that was only physics. The roll went out farther, came back slower, reached a new angle that made the mind revise its map of what was possible. Light flickered. Then it failed. Darkness gathered in the passageways, not like night, but like an object filling a space. The distress call went out. Steady words bent thin by static, a voice declaring position and condition while the world around it unraveled sentence by sentence. Ashore, men put on oilskins, engines started. A tug tested its lines and bowed under the first slap of a gust. But Typhoon Marie had work everywhere. She had already seized other ferries and would seize more before the night let go. Rescue is a race that weather often wins. The first grounding came at 10:05. It felt like the hull had tried to chew rock and cracked a tooth. The sound was a long grind that crescendoed into a thump you could mistake for hope. People cheered. Hope is a reflex, not a plan. The next wave lifted the Tōya Maru and threw her down again, and this time the tearing had a different note. Ripped metal, the sudden surrender of a seam, the whoomph of water finding a big door left ajar. Flooding that had been a problem became a fact. The list deepened. Gravity shifted allegiance. On the slanted vehicle deck, the freed wagons were a demolition derby without drivers. They smashed and slid and punched holes where holes should not exist. A car rose, pivoted, hammered its roof, and stayed that way because the angle would never again be the angle cars are meant to sit on. Seawater ran along the deck in a glittering river full of bolts and splinters and things with edges. A deckhand took a step that had always been a step and went nowhere, his feet bicycling in air until his shoulder found steel. He laughed once, too loud, at the shock of it not being a fall he could argue with. In the cabins, mothers made their bodies into corners for children that no longer existed. A steward with a torch went door to door, becoming a lighthouse in his small world, pointing people up and forward, even as up and forward kept moving under his feet. A man in a hat he'd been proud of for 20 years put it carefully on the hook, then took it back and crushed it between his hands because the action of doing something felt useful. A nurse. A nurse is always present in disaster stories because they carry stubbornness in their bones, tied a cork belt around a stranger and told him gently that yes, he should put his arms through, not around it, as if they had all the time in the world for manners. Lifeboats, were theory meeting angle. Davits swung like angry pendulums. A boat slammed the hull and splintered. Another went away with more space in it than it should have had, because people could not get to it in time, because timing had become a trick the ship played on them. Some passengers jumped because the choice to leap is still a choice you can make with your own legs when the ship begins to make all the other choices for you. The water took them coldly. September is not winter, but cold at sea is not a calendar. It is an argument with your breath you usually lose. Bodies clenched, lungs shouted, fingers forgot how to be hands. A man came up next to a cork fender and held it like a relative. A woman wrapped both arms around a plank that had been a table, that had been a meal hours ago, that had been a plan for tomorrow. On shore, rescuers made a human machine. They tied ropes around their middles and went in, letting the sea shove them back, and then meeting it again, timing the pull like wrestlers who had learned the opponent's habits. They dragged one, two, none. They went again. They learned each survivor's weight instantly through the rope in their hands, learned who wanted to live by the way a grip felt when it found purchase. They hauled boys who had not yet shaved, and men whose faces were already gray with the sea's special exhaustion. The beach traded bodies with the surf all night and resented every trade that didn't stick. Some lived because of decisions that would sound foolish later, but were correct in the moment. A soldier kicked off boots that had served him across winters because their loyalty was misplaced here. He reached shore with naked feet full of cuts and would bless every cut for years. A clerk unbuckled a bag of tickets he had meant to protect because paper has no weight compared to breath. He reached for a rope with both hands and would later remember the shame of that moment, as if shame had any business in survival. A boy slid under and under again and found, when he surfaced the last time, that a rope had wrapped itself around his chest like a sash. He would never know the man who'd thrown it, and the man would never know the boy's name, and both would talk about each other in kitchens until their voices softened. Near midnight, the Tōya Maru made its final decision. The list that had been a tilt became a slope, became a wall turned into a floor. Something deep, some strength pressed into the hull at the yard and, blessed in a ceremony no one remembered now, gave up with a sound like a cathedral tired of holding. The world rotated. Down moved. People slid toward it. A suitcase became a weapon. A porthole became a door became a trap. There is a moment in a capsize when time stretches like a wire drawn too thin. A breath lasts a year. A reach covers a lifetime's length. A thought about a mother's hands is both a cradle and a drowning. Then the wire snaps and everything happens at once. Darkness took the rooms that were still rooms. Sea filled the spaces that were still spaces. Air became a thing with edges that fled upward into pockets you could aim for if you guessed right and remembered to keep your mouth closed. And then there was no ferry, only a field of fragments and an argument of water and wind. The wreck lay insultingly near to shore, close enough that the beach lights looked like promises that had merely been mispronounced. The wind howled less arrogantly as the hours worked on it, but the sea kept its busy hands moving, lifting, dropping, taking. Somewhere a half-smashed lifeboat bobbed and disappeared and bobbed again. Men counted heads, lost count, counted again. Someone sang not because singing was sensible, but because the body sometimes chooses an old tune when arithmetic fails. Dawn came like the aftermath of a crime. The sky went the color of unpolished metal. The wind forgot its anger and remembered its job. On the sand, wreckage arranged itself into eloquent rows. Planks, broken chairs, a wallet flayed of its leather, a rice ball sealed by luck in its tin that looked obscene in its ordinariness. Rescuers stopped when their hands would not close anymore and started again when someone called a name. Families came with the way faces look when they are braced for a truth, and the truth comes anyway. Of the more than 1,100 souls aboard, fewer than a quarter would stand in the sun again. The number never sits quietly on the page. It shifts if you stare at it, because numbers try to be neat, and this was not neat. The headline writers reached for language and found only lists and laments. A nation that had been willing itself forward, steel, schedules, rebuilt cities, new timetables set like metronomes, stumbled and looked back at the water so that it could remember what lived under the habit of progress. Afterward came the necessary rituals of blame and learning. Investigators ran fingers along torn steel and pointed at angles where the deck had become a weapon against its own. They spoke of anchoring decisions and lee shores and cargo that must not become a herd. They noted the way a steam plant's failure becomes not just silence, but helplessness. The way a train ferry, with its long, open spaces and its obedient rails, must be treated as a room that can turn into a ramp if you let water in. They did not speak loudly of the desire that had threaded itself through the day, the desire to believe a weather window was a promise and not a trick, but it lay beneath their diagrams like a watermark. Routine can make courage and it can make blindness, and in bad weather, the two are siblings that look too much alike. Policy, like grief, prefers to do something. The idea of a tunnel beneath the strait had been old enough to have dust on it. In the wake of the Tōya Maru and the other ferries lost that night, the dust was blown off. Engineers sharpened pencils and then broke rock. Years later, trains would pass under the seabed, in air measured and dry, at a remove from the sky's moods. The Sunken tunnel would be drawn in neat linework on maps, and the crossing would turn into minutes, and the public would learn to think of the strait as a solved problem. But tunnels, like memorials, are not undoings. They are replies. People replied too in their smaller ways. Harbor masters learned to hear the sentence the wind says that begins with not and ends with tonight. Captains counted one more set of variables before trusting the lull. Families kept photographs next to radios and said names softly when the weather turned mean. Survivors developed rituals that looked strange to others. A man who would not drink tea on rainy nights. A woman who always checked the door latch twice at dusk because the sound reminded her of a hatch dogged shut. A boy who grew into a father who never sat with his back to a window when it stormed. Go to Hakodate on a gentler day and stand where the quay meets the breakwater, and you can see how narrow and how wide a strait can be at once. The water muscling between islands looks like a river trying to remember the sea. Ferries come and go with their square, confident faces and their appetites for freight. On board, a child presses his nose to the window and draws shapes in the fog of his breath. A clerk checks a watch because the timetable still feels like a promise. Somewhere below, chains are being tightened by hands that have learned to distrust the easy click and tug. They take one extra link and set it. A whistle moans across the harbor, that human note we taught steel to make, longing bent into function. The story people tell about the Tōya Maru is not a ghost story, even if wind and distance give it the same chill. It is a story about decisions made in weather and about the way weight moves when the floor refuses to stay faithful. It is about how fast confidence can turn to pleading, and how pleading can turn to the kind of quiet that comes when you are doing everything you can, and know it may not be enough. It is about hands on a rope and hands on a child's shoulders, and hands letting go of a suitcase so they can hold a stranger instead. It is about a coastline close enough to see and still too far to reach. What the sea asks, it asks consistently. It does not negotiate. It keeps no ledger that can be balanced with apologies. The night the Tōya Maru went over, within sight of shore and within earshot of voices calling names, the strait collected more lives than a nation could accept, and so the nation answered in steel and discipline and memory. The answer has held most days since, because that is the work of answers. But when the barometer falls and the wires on the poles begin to hum, when smoke from a funnel goes suddenly horizontal and the door glass trembles as if trying to warn the room, the story sharpens in the mind again. We cross because life requires crossings. We measure, we bind, we build ways that are safer than the ways before. And we keep telling the night of the Tōya Maru, so that habit never again disguises danger well enough to be mistaken for a promise. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.